Good, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on US and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Polaris Live is in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global readership for your confidence in our unbiased global coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. My guest today is Dr. Michele Geraci. Dr. Geraci is the former Undersecretary of State, Ministry of Economic Development, Republic of Italy. He's been made a Knight of the Republic of Italy for his accomplishments. Professor of Practice in Economic Policy, Nottingham University, Ningbo, Honorary Professor, Peking University School of Economics, Adjunct Professor of Finance, New York University, Shanghai, En-ROAD's Climate Ambassador, Climate Interactive, MIT. Please join me in welcoming, from Shanghai, China, Michele Geraci.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here again.
Thank you for taking time to come. I know you have a busy schedule today, Michele, so I want to get right into these list of issues that I'd like to discuss. So, in 2019, the Italian government signed the Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding with China. It was a landmark agreement, the first G7 country to do so. You were a key architect of this landmark initiative then, because you were in the government and knew the value of it to Italy. Since then, your advice has proven itself. Trade between Italy and China has increased to a record of 73 billion euro. Italy is now among the forefront of EU countries' trade with China. This memorandum of understanding comes up for renewal next year. Surprisingly, as we read in America, the government of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni says she's not sure if the memorandum of understanding should be removed or renewed next year. What's happening here, Michele?
Thank you. Very interesting question. I think I may answer in two parts. One is what I think Italy should do, and the other one is what I think they will do, actually, what we will do, what the new government will do. To give you a very punctual answer, I of course do think that Italy needs to renew the MOU, and we'll go into the details why I believe so. It's not just because I was pushing for it 4 years ago, but because I think it is, and it was, and it is now a good idea and beneficial to Italy. What I think the Italian government will do, I can say with, of course, less degree of certainty, but I think they will renew it. For the reason that I just said, they do know that this is a important agreement with China. It is positive for our enterprises, and the government, which is of course a center-right government, tends to be a little bit more focused than left-wing government normally are, more focused on the interest of our own country rather than on the interest of the wider international community. Meloni and Salvini and others were elected with a mandate to fix Italian economic problems. The Italian economy is made up, like all economies, by consumption, investment, and export. But in the case of Italy, export is the only component of the three of the GDP that grows, and and it counts for a third of the overall economy. And within that export, the growth engine, the only growth engine, comes from China, like you correctly mentioned, and not just from China, because of course China is a pull factor for trades with the rest of Asia, with the BRICS country, with Africa, and of course with the Belt and Road. So for Italy not to continue the agreement on the Belt and Road, it would mean to sacrifice the only variable that makes our economy grow, and sacrifice a market driven by China of 6.5 billion people. So not a good idea.
Well, it's interesting, but Italy is not alone in taking this kind of a posture, right? The Italian government minister recently said China has pros, being a very important trade partner, but also cons, a development model, a different development model than ours in Italy, different rules on respect for workers' rights, a different approach on the Russian Ukrainian conflict, on climate, on Africa. Now, you've spent many years in China. You speak the language, know the country intimately. I mean, what's happening here? Is the EU taking a very different line from what Italy took some years ago? What's the story here, Michele?
Okay, I tell you, it is correct that China has a different social and economic model. We know that. We know it's a non-electoral democracy. We do know that there are some issues. It's a developing country. China lives this ambiguity. It's the second largest economy in the world, maybe soon the first, but it's made up by people with a low income per capita. So it has this dual role of being a big partner in the international arena, but at the same time, its people are poor. They rank number 60, 65 on income per capita. So with that in mind, it is true that China has problem of equal access to foreign companies, reciprocity, level playing field, the been issue of intellectual property rights, and so on. So the difficulties are their objectives, and we actually have discussed it just today at a meeting with the members of the business community, both European and Chinese, in Shanghai. So we do recognize, and Chinese government does recognize, that they sometimes need to liberalize the modern market to grant better access to foreign European companies. Now, the EU stance on issues such those have changed very dramatically in the last 10 days. Let's say a month ago, the narrative was very anti-China. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was making speeches about how maybe the decoupling, how the human rights, the different values, let's say the support that China is giving to Ukraine. Basically, she was making a speech just days before arriving into China a couple of weeks ago. That was the core was we want to do business with countries that share our values, and implying not so willing to do business with countries that do not share our values. This was her view. By the way, this is a very dangerous, it's a very slippery slope, because when you start putting a fence on mixing economy with politics or values, it's very easy. Let me tell you honestly, Sarwar, that you end up doing business with no one in the world. Because I tell you very honestly, I think Denmark would not be doing business with Spain or Italy or Germany. We don't even have same values within the European Union, let alone values between East and West. So if you start putting an issue of principle that we only do business with those who share our values, I go even further. People from Milan would not necessarily do business with people from Rome. So it is so it is I say almost as a joke, but that's why I say it's a very slippery slope. And so she understood that. She came here. Also, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, also came here. Macron came here. They went back, and the narrative changed a little bit. So von der Leyen now talks about decoupling is not a good idea. It would hurt everyone, so we should not do decoupling. There is even discussion to reopen the CAI, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement between the European Union and China, that was kind of killed in 2019 during the last month of Angela Merkel leadership. So I think she has come here. I talk about von der Leyen. and understood that maybe she saw with her own eyes that this is the biggest market and the biggest growth market in the world. She's also German, so maybe she was convinced by German companies that she should have a more practical tone. She was also told that the European Union, actually reminded that the European Union does not do foreign policy. The European Commission has no, I would say, has no right, has no, let's say, jurisdiction to do
Yes.
common foreign policy for European states. This is done by individual member states.
Well,
So it would be very easy for her not to talk about foreign policy because it has nothing to do with her role, and just focus on business. And I think that's what she may be doing soon.
sure. It's and you know, if I was a Milanese, I would question the shape of the pasta in Rome. You know, I mean, it's a serious matter in Italy, as I understand
Indeed,
it.
indeed, indeed.
But but I don't mean to make light of a very important issue, because the impression we get in America from this Macron Wonderland visit, uh, especially when we saw the news in the evening, the reception that President Macron got versus the exposure to President Xi Jinping that von der Leyen got in return was very stark. And so since then, the International Monetary Fund, has come out with this forecast that over the next 3 to 5 years, China will account for 28%, if I remember my numbers correctly, of the growth in the world. And Europe doesn't even rank in that IMF listing, according to Bloomberg Business News. So I think, does this not also point to the fact that we need to have some balance in how much we trade with people based on principles in one's own country? That's the point you're making, isn't it?
It is because if we mix really geopolitics and values with business, we end up in that situation that we described before. And the growth that comes from China is, you mentioned the 28%, is going to be the main, probably the only engine of growth for the world. Europe and China is the biggest trading partner. So we also, the flip side of having different values, that we are, let's call it, democratic electoral democracies. Not all countries to the same degree, but
Right.
that means that our governments, even when I was in government, our goal is to deliver benefit to the people, not to do what we like as individuals. Relationship between people are different than relationship between countries. I can enjoy dinner with you and you invite me for dinner, and it's not that you owe me back something. We can have a relationship based on liking each other. But governments don't have relationship basing on what they like. They must do the interests of their own people. So
Well,
we don't have to like China, we don't have to like the US, we don't have to like France. We need to do the goods of our own people. And this is very important. And
what do you
basically the
think?
only reason why governments are
Exactly. So
in their jobs.
I
No, they
follow
don't have to
you.
like each other.
I follow you. I mean, it's difficult enough to have 26, 27 countries part of the European Union. I mean, I still think it's a remarkable achievement, but I think that it has to be tempered, is what you're making the point. But let me ask you, in view of what's been happening, what you've just said, do you sense some fault lines coming up between the European Union countries that didn't exist before? Are they
Sorry,
starting to head? Are they starting to think of in a slightly different way of handling the same issue? And I want to relate this, just so we broaden our optic, to the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And
uh,
the points that you have
so
made. Just talk a little bit about that, please.
sorry, let me clarify. When you say country did not exist before, you mean
No,
ex-Soviet Union countries that now joined the EU, or something else? Just to
no.
clarify your point.
Let me rephrase and clarify. Uh, it seems as though there is a growing divergence in the foreign policy and trade policy views of the countries in the European Union. There doesn't seem to be as much agreement as there was, let's say, 2 years ago.
Indeed, this goes back to, first of all, the principle that individual countries do have their own foreign policy. So there is no such a thing as a EU common foreign policy. So what you say is correct. Countries have different foreign policies, not just in principle. I don't mean just they could have different foreign policy, which they do. They have different views, and so they externalize those views in different ways. And it is true that also when there has been contentious issues, like you mentioned, the war in Ukraine, this divergence has emerged more because maybe for the first time in many years, the foreign policy of EU member states needed to actually be something with a practical outcome. So, do we put sanctions? Yes or no? Do we buy gas? Do we do this on that? How do we send weapons? So, until then, until the start of the war between Ukraine and Russia, really the EU foreign policy and the European member foreign policy did not really have anything to worry about. So that's why, we always say in diplomacy, when you don't know anything about what the Minister of Foreign Affairs does, it means it's good news. It's not doing something wrong. Now, with a crisis, of course, this foreign policy needed to emerge at the forefront of the debate. And with it, the differences between member states did emerge. So indeed, we have Hungary, Orban, that has a very different view. They continue to trade with Russia. They are against sanctions. I actually was in Budapest recently to meet with people very close to Orban, and the view in Hungary is very clear. They say, we in Hungary are the true depository of European values. Maybe you think we are more conservative, you think we are right wing. Some people even think that Hungary is not a democracy or extreme right and things like that. But then the guy was telling us, yes, but let's stay away from these labels. What we believe in is closer to the roots of European values than what you guys in the rest of Europe seem to be doing, referring to maybe some extra liberal policies, even extreme free market policies that put at risk our industries, because we don't, of course, we are not ready to compete head to head with emerging markets in Asia, like Vietnam and so on, with whom we have free trade agreements. So even just staying on economic terms without going into social issue, which is also a key difference, Hungary and other states do feel in the same way. The funny thing is that even Poland and some of the Baltic were along that line. But now, when the Ukrainian crisis came about, we now have a more, let's say, stronger position from Poland and the Baltic states for reasons that are fully understood, historical reasons. They did not see in the Soviet Union and Russia the closest friend. And so therefore those four countries, the three Baltic and Poland, are taking a very much strong view to we need to support Ukraine because Ukraine is fighting for our own values. So Orban says, no, they're not fighting for me, they're fighting for themselves. Macron says that we should do more business with China. And of course, every time he comes here, he signs an order for 300 Airbus and opening a new production facility here in Tianjin for final assembly of Airbus. Germany trades 170 billion with China. We do notice that the sanctions against Russia have not worked. Basically, they've been, in my view, a failure because the war goes on. So Putin did not withdraw. So there is no evidence of success of sanctions. Current account surplus in Russia skyrocketed last year to $282 billion, 6 times the value of Italy, that is an export-led economy. So these frictions go back and are getting stronger because the European governments' activity are not delivering results. So the popular consensus for supporting maybe the Ukrainian war is waning a little bit. Some countries do have economic problems. We have a higher inflation. By the way, high inflation caused in large part also by the threat of sanctions that had pushed prices of energy up. So it's a self-induced problem that was done just to be seen to doing something. And this is the problem of European foreign policy. I say we because I'm Italian, but if I was in government, I would do it in a different way. The people who are now in governments in the European countries, they do foreign policy without analyzing things. They just think that something should be right, and they kind of hope that the prediction come true. But this is the complexity of the phenomenon, and the interconnection requires in-depth analysis, not just waking up in the morning and praying that your policy will work out.
Understand. It's allow me, Michele, to remind our viewers that they are listening to one of the few unbiased channels tightly focused on the relationship between US, China, and the world. And they can support us by going to my website, kashmiri.com, signing up for alerts on upcoming programs, and perhaps subscribing to the YouTube channel. Now I'll come back to my guest, Michele Geraci. And Michele, in the few minutes that we have left, I so enjoy talking to you because you have a very broad optic. You relate the dots in countries, and I want to ask you this question. The war between Russia and Ukraine, and this connects to what we've been talking about. The war in Russia and Ukraine, right, is described by the West as a war between authoritarianism and democracy. 85% of the countries in the world have not supported the West sanctions against Russia. Why this discrepancy, do you think?
One is because we need to maybe recenter our point of view away from the center of Europe. Europe has a very Eurocentric view. Every country has. China's name is the middle country, so China thinks that the center of the world is in Beijing.
Yes.
The US thinks it's in Washington, and we think it's in Rome. Those 89 countries, they see the war like something that is 5,000-10,000 kilometers away. And they just mirror the action that we in Europe have done when there have been wars in locations that are far away from ours, like the 40 plus conflicts that go around the world today in various continents in Africa. No, we don't put sanctions or we don't do it the whole time. And so for those 80 plus countries that did not join, let's say, the international community, so-called, they do because they see, yes, it's a regional war between two countries, Ukraine and Russia. Maybe which is not true, by the way. This is a proxy war between the West and, like you say, and Russia. Not just a totalitarian system, but it's just against. It's between Russia and the West. But for those countries, even if this has the possibility of escalating into a wider conflict, for now it is a war that's been going on for 14 months within, let's say, 300 kilometers of land. And so they say, well, we don't need to join. We have other things to worry about, which is feeding our people. So India, for example, has been buying, if my memory doesn't fade me, about 8 times more oil from Russia than it did last year. China imports of oil have also gone up. Japan is continuing to invest in the Sakhalin project in oil exploration in Russia. Lavrov was in Brazil a few days ago, meeting with the foreign minister, and the relationship with the new president Lula is very strong. The relation between Modi and Putin is very strong. The thing is, this anti-Russia sanction that the West has placed, for reasons that I don't discuss. I'm an analyst. I don't say if it's right or wrong. I tell you what happens. What happens is that the rest of the world, so the other 150 countries, are accelerating the process of getting close to each other. Even India and China seems to have buried the hatchet of war, and at least find some way to cooperate. Even China and Vietnam, not the best friends historically. So the rest of the world, let's call it the south of the world, so the people know what we're talking about, is getting together. We have more use of renminbi. It's not that the dollar is going to disappear, but people are starting doing other things. We have China brokering peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is a major achievement. I now hear talks about Israel and Iran, if there were to be some adjustment in the Iranian internal politics. So we have an increasing role of these big countries, let's call it the BRICS country, who are now starting to develop and offering peace deals. But maybe the Western media has not caught up on the importance of the Saudi-Iran agreement. It means that China is getting a stronger presence in the Middle East. Of course, Israel is a different kind of thing, but you never know. I heard on a few weeks ago, former head of Mossad saying, we really have nothing against Iran per se. We had a good relationship with Pahlavi in the past. So I think there are, I call it earthquakes, that the West is facilitating and the other countries are taking advantage of. And so I'm very worried that this decoupling and these activities that are based on not so deep analysis do lead to what I call it self-inflicted pain on us. Then our government lose the popular support because people say, well, I sacrificed myself for a year. I did not consume energy because you told me that the war would end. Now it has ended. I get inflation. I lost my job. And so governments in the West get weaker and weaker. And the risk is to get into this loop. The more mistakes they make, the more they hide it. But at some point, people understand because they look at their own pockets and they get emptier and emptier while everyone else does business. And the war continues.
And the war continues. And I might
Unfortunately.
point out at this time that the International Monetary Fund expects growth contributions, Michele, from Brazil, Russia, India, and China to outpace the group of 7 countries. So this all ties together. And in the closing seconds that we have, it almost seems to me that the Ukraine-Russia war has brought the West closer together on the one hand. Perhaps for how long, I don't know. But it has also very powerfully brought the global South together. And so we are heading towards a whole new paradigm in international geopolitics. Do you think, Michele?
I think so, and I am more stronger on the second part of your statement that the rest of the world is getting closer to each other, and I do fear that this unity of the West may be apparent, and in the short term may indeed be stronger, but like I briefly touched on just now, when the results are not delivered, even this unity between the Western countries will emerge because we are competitors with each other. The Italy strongest and most fearful competitor is not China, it's not Brazil, it's not Russia, it's France, it's Germany for manufacturing. We make similar things. So at some point, it's a zero-sum game, and that's why I fear protectionism will even re-emerge within Europe. So we have a lose-lose situation. The others get stronger, and we get weaker.
Well, Michele Geraci, thank you for appearing with us once again. Your views are frank, candid, and much needed. So deep appreciations to you.
Thank you for your invitation. Very kind of you.
And I want to now thank our viewers from around the world. We appreciate your listening to Polaris Live, perhaps one of the most unbiased channels that deals with US, China, and world policy. Please join us again in a coming Polaris Live interview, which will be brought to you from Cairo, and continue to support us. Until then, goodbye.